Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Von Lodge, the fantastic, scientifically advanced, futuristic kitchen of the Rustic Von Lodge, where I am here to talk to you about a brand new reading event, Rocket Summer. Rocket Summer, the reading event where we read classic science fiction all month long in July. It's amazing! What an incredible reading event! Who came up with this thing? Must have been a genius, whoever it was. Anyway, Rocket Summer. The perfect chance to read all of those classic science fiction books that you've been dying to read, and perhaps discovering some science fiction books that you were unaware of. And you probably will come across some of those because this event has a bunch of really awesome co-hosts. A bunch of booktubers decided to join me in this endeavor, for which I really appreciate. I will link all of those amazing channels down below. Check out their incredible videos. And I mean, there's going to be a bunch of Rocket Summer videos coming out any day now. Just watch. It'll be amazing. And you might discover a bunch of books that you hadn't heard of or wanted to read. Who knows? And this reading event, like many reading events on BookTube, is divided up into 4 different weeks with 4 different prompts, which you can ignore if you feel like. You can ignore them if you want, but they're there nonetheless. So, Rocket Summer, all about vintage classic science fiction, is divided up into 4 different weeks, which cover different time periods. So the entire event goes from the beginnings of science fiction, whenever you feel that might have been. Was it Frankenstein? Was it before Frankenstein? You can go back. You could go back with science fiction quite a ways. So the beginnings of science fiction all the way up through the 1960s. Now, in the 1960s, the new wave happened, which changed science fiction significantly and permanently. And science fiction was really not quite the same after the new wave. And so I put the cutoff for Rocket Summer to be the year 1970. That's when the event ends as far as what we're going to be reading is concerned. And so in the first week, we're going to be reading books all the way from the beginning of science fiction up through the year 1939. That's week 1. You can read anything from that time period. In week 2, it'll be the 1940s. So any science fiction story or novel from the 1940s. Then, during the 3rd week, it's the 1950s. The 1950s was a fun year for classic science fiction. So any novel or story from the 1950s, and then the last week will be the 1960s, when some of the most interesting science fiction stories and novels were published. So yeah, it spans all of those decades, so you can follow along with the course of vintage science fiction as science fiction changed over the decades. It'll be fun. It'll be fun. And so I put out a video, I don't know, a few weeks ago, where I talked about Rocket Summer and all of the possibilities for Rocket Summer and some of the books that I might read. And there still are a lot of possibilities for this event. But I have chosen some books that I know for sure I'm going to be reading during Rocket Summer. So I'll show you those books. So I'm going to read these for sure. I mean, unless there's an actual alien invasion, unless that happens, which is frankly a little unlikely. I guess it could happen though. I mean, if there is an actual alien invasion, I probably won't get a chance to read all of these. But otherwise, I'm definitely going to read these books in July. And hopefully I will still have time to read other books from my pile of possibilities video that I did for Rocket Summer a while back. So let's talk about those books that I'll be reading. So, the first book, which I'm actually reading now, I started a little early, and that is a very strange book. This book is very strange. This is A Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay. This is also part of Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. And someone did point out when I showed this book in another video that for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, I chose the most expensive edition of David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus that you can get. I think that's probably true. So this is A Voyage to Arcturus, a very strange book by David Lindsay, which is also a fantasy, but it's also a kind of science fiction story. It certainly has elements of science fiction in this book. This book was written in 1920, and it's really interesting. I haven't got that far in it. How far am I in this book? Let me find out. I am at page 60. Okay, I'm on page 60 of A Voyage to Arcturus. So I'm going to be reading, actually I am reading this. I'm reading this for the first week. And like I said, really interesting, really weird book. It's kind of ahead of its time in some ways. It kind of reminds me of some of the stuff that you will find in the new wave of science fiction decades later. So it's really interesting in that way. And I'll talk more about this book once I've finished it. But it's weird, man. This is a weird book. And like I said, it is also a fantasy. It's more of a fantasy than science fiction, but it definitely has science fiction elements. You know, it takes place on another planet for one thing, with very, very strange alien beings. And man, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in this book. So I'll talk about this at a later date once I finished it. But yeah, A Voyage to Arcturus, that's the first thing I'm reading for Rocket Summer, for the first week of Rocket Summer, which is any science fiction book written up through 1939. Now here's another book that I am going to be reading for sure, and I'm really looking forward to it because I have read this before, but it's been a number of years since I've read it, and that is Edgar Rice Burroughs' The Land That Time Forgot, which is not a book I was planning on reading, but I am also reading every book written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, more or less in the order that they were published. And the next book on the list happened to be this one. So I thought, that's perfect for the first week of Rocket Summer, because this is a science fiction story. It's also an adventure story. It's also a Lost World story, which takes place on an island populated by dinosaurs and some other very strange creatures. And it actually is a science fiction story. And there's some weird stuff in this book. Not as weird as A Voyage to Arcturus, but then what is? But it's awesome. And I remember really enjoying this when I read it before. So The Land That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I can't remember off the top of my head when this was first published as a book. Let me see if it says. It probably doesn't. Okay, this is reprinted from the 1924 edition. So, again, 1920s. Land That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Really looking forward to this. So this is going to be the book that I read for sure for the first week of Rocket Summer. I'm hoping I have time to squeeze in another one, but I don't know which one that will be. We will see. But this is definite, The Land That Time Forgot. Then we're going to be moving on to the 1940s. What am I going to be reading for the 1940s? Well, I've decided on this one. This is one I'm going to be reading for sure, and that is Assignment in Eternity by Robert A. Heinlein, which is a collection of stories. All the stories were written in the 1940s by that guy, Heinlein. And I've always intended to read more Heinlein than I've read. I read some of his novels, but he wrote a lot. And there's a lot I haven't read from this guy. So this is one of the things I'm going to be reading. So for sure, I'm going to be reading Assignment in Eternity. I've got a couple of different editions of this book, but this is the one I like the most because of that really awesome cover. So yes, Assignment in Eternity, the 1940s, Heinlein. Going to be reading this. And I probably haven't read any of the stories in this volume. There's 4 stories: Gulf, Elsewhen, Lost Legacy, and Jerry Was a Man. So I'm going to be reading all of those. I'm going to be reading this for the 1940s. So that's something that I'm for sure going to read. And then I'm moving on to the 1950s with the most 1950s science fiction novel that I could think of, and that's this one. This is The Invasion of the Body Snatchers by Jack Finney, which has been made into at least 3 films, 2 of which I really liked. My favorite is the one from the 1950s, although there's a 1970s version of this film, or this story, which is really, really good. So, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. So, I think I read this before, but if I did, it was years and years ago. And of course, my memories of it are all confused with the film versions because I've seen the 1950s film like a million times. I love the 1950s version of The Invasion of the Body Snatchers film. And this is, of course, you can tell by the cover, which somebody drew on. But this is, of course, a 1960s copy. This paperback is from 1961, if I'm remembering correctly. But 1950s story. When was it published originally? Does it say? Copyright 1954. So this came out in 1954. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I'm going to read this for sure. And of course, there's so many other books from the 1950s and stories from the 1950s that I could read. So we'll see. I don't think this is the only thing I'm going to be reading for the 3rd week, but for sure I am going to be reading that. And then we get to the 1960s, one of the most creative decades for science fiction. And I'm going with a Frank Herbert novel, he who wrote Dune, one of the greatest science fiction novels of all time. Some will claim that Dune is the greatest science fiction novel of all time. I'm not sure that's true, but it's up there. But I'm going to be reading this one. This is The Green Brain by Frank Herbert. The Green Brain by Frank Herbert, which sounds really, really interesting. And I never hear anybody talk about The Green Brain from Frank Herbert. I never hear anybody talk about any of the books that Frank Herbert wrote other than the Dune books. So, yeah, this is a definite for the last week of Rocket Summer, the 1960s. Oh, I've always intended to read more Frank Herbert than I have, and so, yeah, definitely going to be reading this. Again, so many other books I could read for the last week. So many great books were written in the 1960s. This is, of course, the decade when science fiction transformed into something new. And so much great stuff from the 60s. But this is a lock. This is definitely something I'm going to read. So those are things that you'll be hearing me talk about in the future. The future. So yeah, there you go. Be sure to check out all my other amazing co-hosts, which like I said, I have linked down below. We're going to have great fun for Rocket Summer, and I will catch you later.